sharing the findings with colleagues inside and outside of the department, as well as outside of the World Bank. I'd like to welcome our online audience, both on WebEx as well as YouTube, as well as our in-room audience today. Thank you for coming. Today, I'm really glad to introduce my colleagues, Stephen Pennings and Norman Loayza, who will be talking about the project they co-lead on the World Bank's long-term growth model. And this is on the occasion of the launch of their book on the project, actually. Here, let me just hold up the book so you can see it. Available at fine bookstores everywhere, including the World Bank's online bookstore. Stephen is a senior economist in the macro and growth team of the research group here. His research interests include fiscal policy, especially fiscal transfers, economic growth, political economy, exchange rate pass-through, and monetary policy. Norman is the director of the indicators group within DEC, the Development Economics Vice Presidency. And he was formerly in the research group, so we claim him as an honorary member. He was a lead economist in our development research group and managed the Asia hub of the research group based in Malaysia. He was the director of the World Development Report 2014 on risk and opportunity, managing risk for development. His research has dealt with various areas of economic and social development, including macroeconomic management, economic and social development, including microeconomic flexibility, private and public saving, financial depth and stability, natural disasters, and crime and violence. A broad range and a fascinating research history. Unfortunately, our previously scheduled discussant, Manuela Francisco, had a last-minute conflict, and she is unable to join us. Thankfully, we have Andrew Burns, who has agreed to step in to be our discussant today. Andrew is the World Bank's global lead for macroeconomic modeling and works in the bank's macroeconomics and fiscal management global practice. Prior to joining the macroeconomics practice, he worked for 10 years as the manager and lead author of the World Bank's Global Economic Prospects Report, which examines trends in the global economy and how they affect developing countries. Before joining the World Bank, Andrew was with the OECD, where he was the head of desk for Czech Republic, Hungary, and Poland and France, and also played a lead role in OECD's job study, overseeing the evaluation of labor market policies in each of the organization's 30 member countries. So today I'll ask Norman and Stephen, and they're going to split the time between them, to talk for approximately 40 minutes, after which we'll hear from Andrew for about 10 to 15 minutes. We'll conclude the session with Q&A from the audience. If you have a question, please use the raised hand option in WebEx. Or, of course, if you're in the room, please just raise your hand. Or signal to me online in the chat that you have a question. I'll call on you. If you're following on YouTube, please submit your question in the chat, and that will get relayed to me. As a reminder, we are recording the sessions, and please mute if you are not speaking. So with that, let me turn it over to Stephen and Norman.
Good morning. Good morning, everyone. Stephen and I are going to present a brief introduction to the book that we have edited on the long-term growth model. It is a collection of articles that are about the fundamentals, extensions, and applications of the project of the same name. So football fans would like to play like Messi. And pop singers would like to sing like Aretha Franklin. For economic growth, countries would like to grow like Korea. And why? Because Korea's economic growth in the last 6 decades has been spectacular. They were able to achieve an annual growth rate of 7.2%, almost 6% per capita. With that, they increased the GDP per capita by a factor of 30 over the 6 decades. And having less than 10% of GDP of the US by 1960, by the 2021, they were over 50% of that level. So Korea is clearly the growth star. Now, why should countries be so interested in economic growth? Well, because simply put, economic growth is the foundation of social and economic development. It generates jobs and income, especially for a labor force, young labor force entering the market. It fosters innovation and entrepreneurship, which in turn creates more growth, especially when it's inclusive and sustainable. It can promote political and social stability, and it provides resources to the state so that the state can in turn provide public services and infrastructure. Now, it is therefore the key, economic growth, the key to eliminating poverty and providing for shared prosperity. Now, of course, this can be achieved especially when growth is inclusive, when it's sustainable, and when it's enduring. It's not a surprise, therefore, that economic growth is at the top of policy agendas around the world. Now, dreaming big on growth is maybe a good thing under certain conditions. So yes, dreaming big on growth is good if you are implementing a sound economic strategy, that one that will allow you to achieve a realistic growth rate. But it may be problematic if it leads you to poor decision making and social frustration. For instance, if you have expectations for growth that are just very high rather than realistic, governments may go in a path of very large public expenditures, deficits, and debt that they will not be able to pay in the future. It may also distort the plans that they may have. For instance, if they think that growth is going to be very high, then they might want to spend in luxuries rather than necessities, or have their priorities all wrong. And when these high expectations for growth are not met, then social frustration can ensue. With that, disappointment and social unrest are unfortunately likely outcomes. The government may lose credibility if they just present this very high expectation for growth. So the origins of the long-term growth model are actually related to this as a reality check. We wanted to see if the growth projections that many countries were making actually were supported by a standard neoclassical growth model. Here, for those who know the literature, associated to the names of Solow and Swan. But after becoming a reality check, we realized that we could do more with this tool, and then it became an explanatory tool, one that would allow us to produce alternative growth scenarios, and also a way to understand the drivers of growth that are behind those scenarios, including drivers related to policy. So there was a lot of interest in the LTGM, and that generated, in fact, a demand for richer models. So the project expanded in terms of the number of models that we were able to produce. They were supported by academic papers, and we made a strong effort to implement each of the models that we produced with a toolkit. So each of the models that we have are carried in toolkits that can be used in a very simple way. They are transparent. They are, as I said, easy to use, and you can download all these from the project's website, which is given here in the slide. So let me tell you about the book structure, which will also be the structure of our presentation today. So the title of the book tells you what this is about. We have a section on the fundamentals of the long-term growth model. The first is a chapter on the standard, the basic model. Then we have some extensions dealing with public capital, productivity growth, and natural resources. And we present a number of applications of how this has been done in different contexts for different countries. In fact, this is only a selection of the many applications that we have conducted over the years. Let me start actually from the end and tell you very briefly about these applications. We did one for Malaysia. The basic objective there is to study the transition of Malaysia from a middle income to high income economy. And we found that one of the main impediments of that transition was the low female labor force participation. And we had some recommendations regarding that particular area of improvement. The second application is on Korea. Well, I told you already that Korea is the growth star around the world. And we wanted to see if the model that we use now for projections could actually be used also to explain what happened in Korea in the past. So this is rather than a futuristic application, is one that goes into a retrospective to study the engines of growth. And what we found through that study is that the drivers of growth actually change over time. In the 1960s, we had labor and human capital being the main drivers. In the 1970s, it was mostly about capital accumulation. And from the 1980s onwards, it was productivity growth. In the case of Bangladesh, the third application here in the list, we wanted to study if the high growth rates that the country has been able to achieve would continue in the future. And the conclusion that we arrived was that investment was not enough, actually, and that the total factor of productivity would have to increase if the country was to continue with high growth rates. The Syria example is very different. The Syria example actually looks at the devastation that occurred because of the brutal war, civil war in the country. And we did a study that you could regard maybe as science fiction here of what would happen after the war. And what we did was to link these scenarios of growth in Syria with political settlements that will drive reconstruction assistance and also voluntary repatriation of people into Syria, and how the different political settlements actually led to very different conclusions. The last two applications on Egypt and Sri Lanka are there also mostly for sentimental reasons, you could say, because this is the way that we started the project, studying Egypt and Sri Lanka. So we wanted to acknowledge those origins where we mostly use the model as a reality check. Okay, so this is half the book, but I think we can say that it's covered, and we invite you to read the applications if you're interested. Let me briefly talk about fundamentals now. So, as I said before, we work with a neoclassical growth model. It has three building blocks. One, a production function that many of you are familiar with. It has a output being the result of combining productivity, here denominated by letter A, then capital, and labor augmented by human capital. And there are decreasing returns to the factors of production, capital and labor, which makes it a neoclassical growth model. There is the second building block is a capital accumulation equation that tells us that capital decreases with depreciation and increases with investment. And we were interested very much in the demographics and labor market forces that drive growth. And we realized that, of course, in the production function, what matters is the number of workers. But for welfare purposes, we want to understand GDP as a ratio to population, so GDP per capita. Of course, the connection is related to two factors. One is the working age population, here represented by this ratio of W over NT, and N is population, W is working age population, and the labor force participation, that is L divided by W. So working age population, something demographic, population growth is a demographic force, and labor force participation, in fact, is a choice. Okay, so if you do a little math here, you will get a growth equation. It's an approximation, but one that is very sensible, where you have that GDP growth is a function of productivity growth. It's a function of things related to people, like human capital, demographics, and labor force participation. All of these multiplied by the returns to labor, beta in this case. Then you have the capital segment. This is investment multiplied by the marginal product of capital and the depreciation component. So this is an important equation that we use in our projections. You can see how all the factors that I have been discussing affect actually growth. And this is what we have in terms of how we go from conditions and assumptions to outcomes in the model. So we have some initial conditions, and the model worked very well because it relied on very simple assumptions, very simple initial conditions. We just needed to know the capital to output ratio, a few parameters, and also the capital labor shares and the depreciation rate. Once we had those conditions taken from reality, we didn't invent those, we took them from the data, then we applied a number of assumptions on the future path of growth drivers. I already told you what those growth drivers are: productivity, human capital, demographic growth rates, and importantly, the investment rate. So this is where the art comes in, what the right assumptions should be. And then we create, with different assumptions, scenarios. And those scenarios will lead us to the outcomes of interest. The most relevant outcome in this presentation is the growth rate. But actually, we explain in one of the chapters there how you can link changes in growth rates to poverty rates as well. And you can use some assumptions on the distribution of income in society. And if you do that, then you can link changes in growth rates with changes in poverty. So that's the way it works. And I can just tell you one illustration of a lesson that we can derive from this very simple model. So this is a result that investment-led growth by itself is not sustainable in the long run. Why can we say that? Why? By looking at this equation. Well, we can say it because if we increase, in fact, this investment rate, what's going to happen is that the capital output ratio is going to increase. And if you look at that equation where it says the marginal product of capital, capital output ratio is in the denominator, which means that actually there will be a decrease in that factor. What that means really in intuitive terms is that since there are decreasing returns to capital, as you increase the capital output ratio, then the strength of capital in producing growth goes down. And that's something that in the end will eliminate the growth force that investment can have. Therefore, the policy advice is that if you want to achieve growth in the long run, then you cannot rely just on investment. It must be accompanied by other sources that drive growth, like human capital, productivity, improvement in labor force participation, etc. So, generally speaking, what we are advocating here for a broad-based growth strategy. Okay, so I have in just a few minutes cover the fundamentals. There's a lot more in the book, and I will invite you to read what is behind. So now I will discuss one of the extensions, and then Stephen will discuss two other extensions and also provide us with the conclusions. So the extension that I will discuss has to do with productivity growth. Now, this is the A letter, the A factor in the equation that I showed you before. It happens to be very important, but it's also something of a black box, a residual, as Solo said in a famous quote. The degree of our ignorance. I think that's what he said more exactly. Well, but in fact, that ignorance can be circumvented if we study what the literature says about the drivers of economic growth, of productivity growth. So we wrote this paper with a colleague in the Malaysia hub, Young Kim. We did a very large literature review on the determinants of total factor productivity. We identified these 5 areas: innovation, education, market efficiency, infrastructure, and institutions as drivers of total factor productivity. We moreover examined what proxies could be used for each of these factors. And what we did is we tried to understand the link between total factor productivity growth and that index that we had created. So we run, this is a simplification of course, but we run a regression of the average TFP growth on this index of the drivers of productivity and the past level of TFP, just to allow for some regression to the mean. And what we found is that the higher the index, the higher TFP growth would be, with a diminishing effect. So we then applied this to a number of cases. And let me show you one of them. I have spoken a lot about Korea. And what we decided to do is see, well, what would happen with TFP growth if countries were to do exactly what Korea did over the last 3 decades? What would happen with the TFP growth of those countries? And we took averages for the different regions, and that's the result of one of the simulations that we did. As you can see, the countries that were lagging behind the most in sub-Saharan Africa and in MENA were able to achieve the highest increases in TFP growth, reaching up to 2%. It doesn't seem like a lot, but over time it builds, and actually it makes a difference. And those countries that were not, that had already increased TFP significantly, like those neighboring countries in East Asia, well, did not benefit all that much from copying Korea, maybe because they had already done it. We could do this also at the country level, and in this case, I show you my own country, Peru, and we did some simulations for Peru, in this case, following Korea, the world leader, or Colombia, the regional leader in Latin America. And we were able to describe first what happened to this index of the drivers of TFP, that's on the left-hand side of this graph, and then the effect on TFP growth rates for Peru. Okay, so I have told you about productivity growth, and now I think it's the time for me to cede the floor to Stephen. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Norman, and thanks everybody for attending. So as Norman mentioned, I'm going to talk today about 2 extensions to the basic model, and the first one of that, it relates to public capital. So the question we try to ask in the public capital extension of the long-term growth model is, what is the quantitative effect of public investment, that is infrastructure, on growth, recognizing that public investment and infrastructure are not always exactly the same, but in many cases they are. So this is obviously a very important question for development policy in general, and in particular for institutions like the World Bank, for lending institutions. So there's kind of two opposing views about this in the literature and in development policy. So one is that public investment and infrastructure investment have a really big effect on growth and should be really at the core of a growth plan. And people refer, for example, to China's very strong growth rates and their high rates of infrastructure investment, large human needs, and of course big infrastructure gaps. So there's a World Bank report that lists 700 million people without safe drinking water and 1.2 billion without reliable electricity. So these are obviously great needs. And there's also some academic literature that also produces very big estimates of the effect of public investment on growth. And this paper is an example of that. So the opposing view is that this is going to have a small effect. And part of that is based on a lot of the empirical evidence from the literature that finds very, very small impacts of higher public investment on growth, and also questions some of the other large impacts that they don't have causal validity. And part of this discussion is about why that would be the case, and obviously corruption and politics are key. So Lant Pritchard has a very famous paper where he argues that in many countries, government investment spending has created very little useful capital. And Knack and Kiefer have a paper that argues that in countries with poor governance, governments use public investment as a vehicle to increase their rent seeking. So these are sort of two opposing views in the literature. We're not trying to get into that debate exactly, but we include an effect on growth, but we also take some of these lack of efficiency seriously. So perhaps a bit more generally in this discussion about public investment and growth, there's a lot of confusion in the literature. Beyond the size of the effect, there's confusion about levels versus changes, the effects on the poorest countries, and of course dynamics. So is it that levels or changes in public investment affect growth? How do the effects vary across countries? And how long do the effects last? If we have a permanent increase in investment in public infrastructure spending, is that going to boost growth forever? So the LTGM public capital extension is going to answer all these questions in a very simple spreadsheet format. And this is joint work with Shamila Devadas. So the LTGM public capital extension is a very simple extension of the basic framework that Norman presented. So one can see, if you start with the production function that Norman showed, there is a total capital stock, which is represented by K here. And so what the public capital extension does, for the most part, is just to split this into two parts. So there's a government capital, which is mostly infrastructure. We also call it public capital. And then there's also a private capital stock. So that's the most important change in the model. Of course, we also take into account this potential lower efficiency. So that's Pritchard and many others' critique, that when you spend an extra dollar on public investment in many countries, you get less than an extra dollar of public capital stock. And we actually produce a new infrastructure efficiency index to measure that, which includes electricity losses, unpaved roads, and water losses as well. And the calibration of the model is based on estimates from the literature, and it builds in a pretty sizable effect of public capital on growth. So more specifically, this parameter means that a 10% increase in the public capital stock is going to boost GDP by 1 to 1.7%. So what is the quantitative effect of a permanent increase in public investment on growth in the model? So this is going to vary across countries. So we're going to look at this for representative countries of each income group. So I think the results can be summarized as saying it's helpful for growth, but it doesn't create a growth miracle. So what we have here is we have kind of an impulse response function where there's a one-time increase in public investment as a share of GDP by one percentage point, and that is a permanent change. And then this is the change in growth. So one can see that there's a modest and temporary boost to growth. So these different lines reflect typical countries calibrated to high income in blue, upper middle income in yellow, lower middle income in black, and low income in red countries. So one can see in the short term that a 1 percentage point of GDP increase in public investment across these different representative countries boosts growth by about 0.15 to 0.2 percentage points in the short run, and then in the first few years. That's excluding demand side multiplier effects, supply side effects only. However, so I'd say that's a modest boost in growth, but it's also a temporary one. So one could see that this line, in terms of the increase in growth relative to the baseline, slopes down over time, and so after 30 years, the boost to growth is only 0.05 to 1.1 percentage point. And the reason for this is that the size of the effect depends on the public capital to output ratio, and there are diminishing marginal product of capital. There's diminishing marginal product of capital over time. When you increase public investment, that's going to increase the public capital stock relative to faster than increasing GDP, and so this ratio is going to increase over time and reduce the effect on growth. The other interesting result here is that for our sort of representative countries, there's actually a pretty similar effect on growth. For high-income countries and low-income countries, it's actually not all that different. And the reason for that is that that on average within those income groups, the public capital to output ratio is not actually all that different. So that's a somewhat surprising result, and obviously very policy relevant. So we produce many results. The model produces many results, and I encourage you to read the chapter for a full explanation. But to summarize some of the main ones. So the effect of public investment and private investment is going to be heterogeneous across countries and also over time. So even though those averages for typical high income, middle income, or low income countries are actually not all that different, within each group there's a lot of heterogeneity. And it's because it depends on the shortages of public capital relative to GDP and private capital relative to GDP. And so those will depend on country circumstances. And that's why we need to have a tool like the public capital extension to calculate the effects on growth. The second interesting finding is that in low-income countries, actually extra private investment has a bigger effect on growth than public investment, which is something which is maybe a little bit surprising. And the reason for that is just that the private capital stock as a share of GDP is really low in low-income countries. And to some extent, that's intuitive because those countries have a lack of access to credit. They often have poor business environments, and so that really constrains private investment. And so the policy advice following that is to try to increase private investment in those countries. The third result is perhaps a little bit more technical, but is also surprising, is that the level of efficiency actually has no effect on the impact of public investment on growth. So this is not our result. It comes from a paper by an IMF working paper by Berg et al. And it sort of stems back to the two forces that embedded in the opposing views I showed a couple of slides ago. So this is a sort of simplified version of the equation Norman showed, adapted to the public capital extension context. And one can see that the first view, if you have low efficiency, which is a low value of theta, you might have, let's say, in a particular country, you might have $1 billion of public capital on the books. But in reality, a lot of that public capital is very poorly constructed. And so the actual effective public capital to output ratio is much lower, and that increases the marginal productive capital. Effectively, it increases the need. But then an offsetting force that moves in the opposite direction is that when you spend an extra $1 million on public investment in those countries, you might only get $500,000 of useful capital because it's poorly installed, it's politically allocated, and so forth. And so one can see that if the efficiency of the new public investment and the old public capital are the same, these effects cancel out. But that's not to say that efficiency is not important. So improving the efficiency of public investment can actually have a sizable effect on growth, and especially in countries that have high rates of public investment. So we applied this model in Malaysia, which is an application in Chapter 5. So in Malaysia is on the verge of moving from middle income to high income status, and policymakers were interested in knowing how they could sustain growth in Malaysia. And one of the things that came out of that discussion was whether we could use higher public or private investment to sustain the growth rate. And so this is the baseline we produced at the time of the growth path in Malaysia going out to 2050, and one can see the declining rate. And then we did some simulations where we had a permanent increase of investment. We had first a 1 percentage point increase in public investment, which led to a short-run increase in growth of 0.15 percentage points. We also increased private investment by 0.3 by 1 percentage point of GDP, and that led to a bigger increase in growth. So in Malaysia was relatively short of private investment, and then we also tried an even larger effect, which is 0.6 percentage points. So one can see that growth, is going up, but what these policies cannot do is to sustain long-run growth, which is what the country was most interested in. This is due to the diminishing marginal productive capital that we've seen many times. And as a result, we needed to consider a combined reforms package of the one that Norman mentioned earlier, taking into account, for example, higher TFP growth, improved human capital, and also labour force variables like female labour force participation. And the details of that are in the chapter. So I finished talking about public capital. I'm going to talk briefly about the natural resource extension, which is the final extension in the book. Not sure what has happened here. There was supposed to be a slide. For some reason, this slide is not loading. But that's okay. So I will have to tell you the idea here, because this slide is not loading for some reason. So the natural resource extension is motivated by the fact that many developing countries have large natural resource sectors. And if that natural resource sector is a very sizable share of GDP, then obviously factors that affect that natural resource sector are going to be really important for long-run growth. And also the model is going to be able to answer questions specific to natural resources. So for example, how do discoveries or resource depletion affect long-run growth? How do commodity price shocks affect long-run growth? And the role of also the government's fiscal rule and how they deal with those fiscal revenues. And the extension of the model is actually a very simple one. So it basically starts with the production function that Norman showed for the standard LTGM, and then just adds an extra term, which is the GDP produced by the resource sector. Okay, so now I think we're back again. This is the output of the resource sector So I'm going to work through an example of oil, but in the model we have a spreadsheet with over 10 commodities calibrated to over 50 countries. So the output is going to be a function of it's going to depend. Output of oil is going to depend on technology, the reserves of oil, and also the capital stock in the oil sector. And so this is kind of an intuitive function. As one can see, when the reserves are depleted, we're going to need more oil capital or better technology to produce the same amount of oil. And of course, when reserves are depleted, you can't produce any more oil. We're going to keep track of reserves based on production and exogenous discovery. So the reserves today are going to be equal to the reserves last year, less production plus discoveries. We can allocate capital across sectors to equalize the value of the marginal productive capital. Governments, and crucially, governments are going to tax resource revenues and can either invest those in the domestic economy, or they can save them abroad, or they can also consume them. We're not going to discuss that today. And it's important to mention that the model captures the long-run supply-side effects mostly through investment of the commodity sector. It doesn't capture short-run demand effects, and those are really important in commodity exporting countries, but they're not a long-run issue. They're more of a short-run issue. So I'm going to talk about a simple example. We had a calibrated model. We calibrated our model to Angola a few years ago, and we had a scenario where we had a 10-year boom-bust cycle in the oil price. So we started the simulation with oil price at $50 a barrel. They went up to $80 a barrel, and they came back down again. And in Angola, which is a very big oil producer, or should I say, oil is a very large share of the economy, the extra revenues generated from a shock like this would be almost a quarter of GDP. And the vast majority of those accrue to the government. And so one can immediately see that the fiscal response of the government is going to be crucial for long-run growth. So in the red line, we have a model. So this right-hand graph is total investment, deviation from baseline. And in the red line, we have a case where the government is going to invest those revenues in the domestic economy. So we're going to have a big spike in investment versus, let's say, in the blue case, if they save those revenues abroad. And this is going to have a big differences in the effect on growth. So the oil price shock is going to have a big effect on gross domestic incomes. So that's basically the purchasing power of domestic residents in Angola, mostly due to this big increase in oil revenues. However, oil prices do not directly affect real potential GDP. And this is sort of another point of confusion. And that's for the very simple reason that real GDP is a constant price measure. So when oil prices go up, most of that is exported, but the real GDP is calculated with constant export prices. So consequently, the effect of commodity price shocks on long-run growth is going to work indirectly, mostly through the effects on investment. So on the right-hand side, I have GDP relative to baseline, and this black line is just basically the increase in the size of revenues, approximately. And one can see that if the government invests all these revenues, it's going to lead to a big increase in GDP. But that increase in GDP lags the boom-bust cycle somewhat. When commodity prices go up, initially it has very little effect on GDP. And then, if it saves them abroad, it has a much smaller impact. Of course, this excludes the short-run demand side effects, which is going to be really important in those countries. Okay, so this is our last slide. The LTGM book contains many models and applications and many policy relevant findings. So We encourage you to read the book to cover all of those, but we want to summarize 4 of those. So the first one is that although all fundamental economic conditions are going to always affect growth, their relative importance varies across countries, and as a result, the growth, performance, constraints, and opportunities also vary with the country context. The second one, which I've mentioned and Norman has mentioned several times, is investment-led growth strategies are going to be unsustainable in the long run. Investment-led growth can boost GDP growth in the medium run, but even in that case, it would need to be accompanied, in most cases, by increases in savings. And finally, high growth usually involves fast total factor productivity growth. So this project has been, so Norman and I are co-GTLs of the project, but we've got support from many people and financial support as well. So thank you to everybody who's put their work into this. And you can download the book from the QR code or also from our website. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Stephen and Norman, for that very clear presentation. We're going to now turn over to Andrew Burns, who is online. As I mentioned in the introduction, Andrew has done his own fair share of growth modeling. So we're very happy to welcome him today. And again, thank you for stepping in at the last minute, Andrew. We're really glad to have you with us.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Dion. It's my pleasure being here, and thanks to the team for such a great presentation. As indicated, I sort of come to reviewing this work somewhat late, and so I apologize if my remarks are not as coherent and well organized as was the presentation. I think that, you know, the LTGM is exactly very much
Eating
what,
again? Yes.
exactly very
I
much
looked
what
at
the
what
team.
solution produce,
Okay, I think
and I
somebody
think
needs to
Daria is
mute.
right.
Sorry, Tia, could you please mute
This
yourself?
is what
Great. So, you know, the framework is exactly what it is. It's a solo growth framework. It's basically very much a standard way of modeling the supply side in economics. It's basically the same supply side, the same long-run determinants of growth that we have in our managed or MF mod models that we use within the bank. And it's the same basic framework that you see in pretty much every economic model of either a long-term or a short-term thing. So nothing wrong there. It incorporates important extensions from the standard solo swan model to deal with the distinction between private and public investment. It has some endogenous growth features for educational attainment. That wasn't discussed today, but it's in the book, and that's really interesting and useful. It has the resource extraction module, which helps to deal with something that is sometimes in some of our clients a very tricky problem, which is how do you deal with the implications of having a really important resource and how it will affect growth going forward. And it has an interesting and simple sort of poverty extension. And as I said, all of those things are, or at least the first 3 of those things, private capital accumulation, demographic effects, population growth, and TFP, those are very much a part of every model. And what is sort of the value added of this approach is the endogenous growth from labor market policy, introducing the quality and quantity of public sector investment into the overall equation, and looking at the changes in the real rents from natural resources. Those kinds of effects are not necessarily in a standard macro model, although like with the LTGM model, they are introduced in those instances in countries where those are important effects. You know, when I was trying to think about how to describe the LTGM model, it occurred to me that in some ways, and I don't mean this in a negative way, it's less a model than it is a product and or a methodology. It's a way of looking at the drivers of long-term growth and trying to quantify their relative importance and hinge discussions that are very much taking place in the very long term into something that is relatively easily um, quantified and understood. So we see growth as a function of productivity, of capital accumulation, of labor force growth, and then we can see, okay, what is the impact of doing something to any one of those determinants on the long-term growth rate of the economy. And I think that I don't know if I'm gonna try and share my screen, which is always risky effort here, just to show one of the slides that the team had up, which is basically the growth drivers, right? And so we have this basic equation, which is at the heart of everything that's being done. So growth is a function of TFP growth, of the rate of growth of human capital, the rate of growth of demographics, so participation rates in the working age population. Then it is a function of the investment to GDP ratio and depreciation. And that leads, among other things, just having that formulation, which is a very standard Cobb-Douglas kind of formulation, leads us to the result that investment-led growth by itself is not sustainable in the long run. I don't have a problem with the result, but I do have a problem with how that result is being discussed and thought about in the presentation and in some of the work that has been done with the model. And I think it's kind of, in some sense, one of the challenges that's there in the modeling system. The result that in the long run, the capital, the investment rate doesn't have an impact on the rate of growth of capital is a very standard, or the rate of growth of potential output is a very standard result from the Cobb-Douglas framework, and it's effectively because in the long run the rate of growth of the capital stock will be equal to the rate of growth of GDP, and that its fundamental determinants are going to be the rate of growth of the labor force and the rate of growth of TFP as a function of the size of the labor force in the overall income share. So, but that's that result that you cannot permanently change the rate of growth of the economy by changing the investment to GDP ratio is very much part of the framework and a standard result. What I object to is the formulation that is not a sustainable source of growth. And I don't object to the statement in itself because it's factually correct, but I think in some sense it misses the point because it tends to make us think, well, if we cannot sustainably increase the rate of growth through capital accumulation, then capital accumulation probably is not a good growth path or a growth story. And I think that's kind of illustrated here nicely in this chart, and a little less nicely in the Malaysian one. We can see that the impact on the growth rate is relatively, in this particular graph, large initially and then diminishes over time. But what that focus on the growth rate alone obscures is the fact that the level of GDP is higher throughout this period. And in fact, the delta on the level of GDP is accumulating over time. So when we were looking at, so if you think about it, the delta on GDP is going to be the integral, or the space underneath that change in the growth rate over time. And if you look at, for example, this graph, we're looking at a change in the growth rate of just a little bit under 1 percentage point of GDP that is sustained, with, although diminishing over time, for a period of 20 years. That's effectively, by my rough and ready calculations, means that in level terms, at the end of the projection here, the level of GDP in Malaysia is 20% higher on the purple line than it is in the black line. And I think that all of us involved in development would say that some policy reform that managed to increase permanently and in a sustainable fashion the level of GDP by 20% is actually a really useful and helpful policy. It may not change the rate of growth in an important manner way out in 2050, but in the result of the interim effects is actually sustained long run and very important. And so that's just one sort of comment that I found worthy sharing with you here. The other issue that I have with the approach is, in some sense, that there's a trade-off, and a trade-off between the sort of simplicity of the model and therefore its ease to use, and then the lack of complexity and therefore the missing of important interactions that are going to be occurring in the economy. And that second effect I found not so much well illustrated in the book as in another instance where the model was used to look at the influence of resource depletion in an oil exporting economy. And just briefly, I sort of extracted it from the model. I can just try and pull it in here. This is coming from the book rather than the presentation. The sort of resource model, or the standard model, is that the GDP is equal to TFP times sort of quality augmented labor times the capital stock raised to the share of each in overall output. And that standard models applied to the non-oil sector. And then the oil GDP is given by a similar function where
Sorry,
it's,
Andrew,
yeah.
what we're seeing on the screen is still the application sustaining growth in Malaysia.
All right, let me just redo the share. I obviously shared the application. No, thank you. Hell the heck. Oh, I hate WebEx. Where is the unshare thing? All right. I think this is actually part of the slide that you were unable to present. So this is us being doubly cursed here. Does anybody want to tell me how I can stop sharing? Oh, it must be up here.
Yep, you stopped there.
I did? Oh, okay, so now I can try sharing again. All right, so this is the, you can see this now, I hope.
Yes.
So this is the slide to which I was referring, and basically the sort of long run resource enhanced model has, for the non-oil part of the economy, the standard Cobb-Douglas approach. So that's the YO there for non-oil. And then the oil economy, or the resource economy, is a similar production function, but where resources are the second important source of growth. And what the model says pretty clearly if GDP is the sum of those two, which I believe is how they're modeling it, and that's indeed how we model it ourselves in our models, then as the amount of reserves declines, then the contribution of the oil sector to overall GDP growth, and in growth terms, the rate of growth declines. But the problem with that is, in my view anyway, is that it's really missing all of the compensating adjustment mechanisms in the economy. And if we think about an oil economy, the classic presentation of it is here's an economy that suffers from Dutch disease. And what is Dutch disease? Dutch disease is the effect of an overappreciated currency, reducing the competitiveness of the non-oil sector. And as a result, the non-oil sector gets squished in the overall activity in the economy. What happens in real economies as the resource sector disappears or its weights declines, then the influence of the Dutch disease effect declines at the same time, and therefore the rate of growth of the non-oil parts of the economy expand. And that whole adjustment mechanism is not going to be here just because we cannot articulate in this model the influence of that exchange rate effect on the productivity of the non-oil sectors. And that effectively results, I think, in sometimes strong results being, or strong conclusions being drawn from this modeling that might not be observed if we were using a model that was able to incorporate these effects. So that's just kind of I guess it's a picky point on my part in terms of the overall approach. I think that it's important to recognize that this approach, or the LTGM model, does have a lot of real benefits, and it can help us take a look at some of the impacts and the influence, and think through the long-term influence of different policies. My sort of, I guess, takeaway is that when we do it, that we want to be careful that, one, we're thinking about the levels, and I think that's one of the challenges of the long-term growth model. It is focusing on the growth rates and the long-term growth rates, and as a result, we might be not giving due attention to what's happening to the level of activity, because it's that level of activity that ultimately is driving poverty reduction and is super important. And the second thing is that because we're missing the price mechanisms, because we're missing important adjustment mechanisms in the economy, we might also be missing important, maybe they're second or third order effects, but sometimes those second or third order effects can be dominant. So bottom line, I think that it's a great tool, and I think the proof of the pudding is the fact that it's been used in many instances. I think one of the big challenges for the model, and that's true for any model, is while it can tell us what would happen if we improved our index of TFP from 5 to 0 points, or to 7, it can't really tell us how to do that. And ultimately, that's the development challenge. So reiterating the point that productivity is, and productivity growth is the most important sort of long-term driver of growth. Absolutely. How do you achieve it? I'm not sure the model is really helping us very much in that regard. So I think that was it. The only last remark that I wanted to make was that I thought, in regards to this how do we achieve it question, that it would be useful for the model to be look at some of the sort of drivers of productivity that are laid out in the CEM 2.0 tool, which sort of does the same kind of exercise, but really tries to look at which are the particular drivers of productivity growth, drivers of participation rate in individual countries that are weak versus those that are relatively strong, and then use that in combination with this tool to motivate discussions. But by and large, I think it's an impressive body of work. I was thinking as I was reading it that it may be the long-term growth model because it looks at growth in the long run, but it's also been a model that's been around quite a while in the bank and has a long history. And I think that both Norman and Stephen are to be congratulated for the contributions that they've made throughout the bank via this tool. Thanks.
Thank you, Andrew, for those comments. Before opening up, I'm going to turn back to Norman and Stephen. Just a reminder, if you have questions in the room, raise your hands when we open it up here. I have a couple of questions from YouTube that I've gotten. If you have a question and you're on the WebEx, please raise your hand or just signal in the chat that you'd like to ask a question and I'll call on you. So over to Norman and Stephen to react a little bit to Andrew's comments. And then Andrew, I'll also come back to you sort of towards the end of the Q&A if you have any reflections. Or feel free to jump in anytime.
Well, Andrew, thank you very much for your comments and for your very kind words towards us and towards the project. Actually, I have to say also that we have collaborated with you over many years and received your feedback, and for that we are also very, very grateful. We initiated this project as a joint product with MTI. And I believe that we have benefited a lot from the interaction with operations. That is, every single extension, every single application was driven by the interest from our MTI colleagues and from our colleagues in operations. So that level of interaction has been very beneficial for us. And I hope that Stephen and I hope that has been also being beneficial for you guys. You pointed out several limitations, and we agree with most of them. I want to add that we see this model as complementary to the work that you, Andrew, and other people in MTI in the Global Prospects group do in terms of short-term forecasting. Our work is not really for the forecasting of growth in the next 2, 3, 5 years. That is very much dependent on international conditions, for instance, dependent on the demand effects, which we don't have in the model because we are actually assessing potential growth rates that depend on this equilibrium between demand and supply, and therefore everything is driven by the production function of the economy. So this is a limitation that we recognize, that we don't consider demand effects and that we don't consider short run and cycles in the economy. But if you regard this as complementary to the work that is done in other parts of the bank, then you see that rather than a limitation, is just a distribution of tasks among different groups in the bank, which we welcome very much. This is the first reaction. The second reaction is that we agree with you that that although investment does not in the long run lead to growth, that's what happens in neoclassical growth models where there are decreasing returns to the factors of production, that the level of GDP is in fact permanently affected, and that it will benefit from any level of growth. That is undeniable. And that is something that we should recognize maybe more explicitly in the presentations that we make. the only thing here to point out is that for many policymakers, for many countries, the challenge is not only to increase the level of income, but actually to increase growth rates, because that is indeed what's going to have a more permanent effect on development. It is a level of how dynamic the economy is, and it's that dynamism which actually leads to development, and that's why we emphasize growth rather than levels. So we recognize the point that you are making, of course. On just the last issue that I will address is on productivity growth. We do have one of the chapters dealing with the drivers of productivity, and what is missing possibly there is that some of the productivity components are actually can be embedded in the other factors of production. So, for instance, when we talk about infrastructure as being a driver of productivity, this could come in the form of some capital. When we say innovation, this could also come in the form of investment of new types. And we go through the simple way of adding that to growth through total factor productivity. But if some of that is embedded in capital, then that will have an effect as well. That's something that we don't consider. But it is an interesting question that we could address in the future. But I will stop at this, and thank you very much, Andrew, again, for not just your comments now, but for the collaboration that we have had over the years.
Yes, thank you very much for the comments. And to reiterate what Norman said, we agree with almost all of them. To add a couple of other more detailed, one of Norman's comments on the level of the effective capital on the level of GDP, we completely agree with that. And I think that some of the discussion, I guess, depends on the country context. So, as Norman mentioned on the first slide, you know, a lot of the countries that sort of come to us have these very big ambitions. And so the only way they can achieve those ambitions is by growing fast for a long time. And we agree that these investment might increase the level of growth, but in order to achieve those ambitions, which is sort of where the conversation starts, it needs to be higher growth for the long term. So on the second point on Dutch disease, so yes, we agree that the model misses some of those effects, and Dutch disease is a particularly tricky one to include in this model because it doesn't have a demand side. You could have some other things, related, like maybe a learning by doing or other things. But the difficulty with a lot of those mechanisms is that they're very hard to calibrate. But the point is well taken, and I think we do need to be careful with how we discuss the findings of the model in a policy context. And also, thank you for mentioning the CEM 2.0 tool. We will definitely have a look at that.
Thanks, Norman and Stephen. Andrew, before coming back to you, I'm going to open it up a little bit to collect some other questions. We have two people online, and forgive me for how I'm going to pronounce this. We have Zelko, and then we have Angela. Let's start with Zelko. Do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yes, indeed. Can you hear me well?
We can, indeed.
That's great. Thank you very much, Norman and Stephen, and also for very pertinent comments by Andy, and a great presentation. I work on Egypt, by the way, Middle East, and we're in the middle of putting together actually preparing a country economic memorandum, which is actually focusing on long-term growth issues. So this is very much kind of on our minds, and we'd very much like to kind of look at the Egypt application and review it and revisit it in this. So I'd just like to kind of add a comment and on that in case of Egypt, I think it's particularly actually useful because Egypt is one of those cases where indeed we do see these kind of fundamental imbalances in the drivers of long-term growth. For example, the female labor force participation is about 15%, if that, right? Extremely low, and it's actually has been declining, right? So you have the L part, very much underutilized, for long-term growth in Egypt. Private investment is also low, reflecting the kind of difficulties in the investment climate and the regulatory environment. But also the kind of a role of the state and the large kind of footprint of the state-owned enterprises, that kind of also take up the space for private sector activity and private investments. So L is not really growing as fast as it should. The private investments are not as high as they should be. Long-term productivity growth, also hasn't been high. So what's left is basically these very large public investments and ongoing, but also the future public investments plans in Egypt that we see. And I think it's a very legitimate question. Is this sustainable? And I think the macro team in MTI thinks it's not. And these other drivers of growth must be kind of revisited and reactivated in one way or the other. How that is to be done, obviously, as Andy says, is easier said than done. But so I think that in the case of Egypt, in the case of these countries where you do have these very large and obvious imbalances between drivers of growth, I think the long-term growth model can point out to some of the important policy directions that can inform the policy dialogue. So I very much welcome that. I would quibble just a little bit and last.
Sorry, Željko, just to give other people a chance as well. Could you keep your comments just one more minute? Please, thank you.
That's the so that was the comment. The main comment on the productivity was that I would quibble a little bit with the notion that the literature is completely kind of unclear about the aggregate contribution of public investments to growth. My own work with Johannes Federke on South Africa data shows that if you actually use disaggregated data on infrastructure down to lower levels of infrastructure sectors, then you actually get much richer estimates and more robust effects than if you just rely on very aggregate figures and cross-country estimates. Thank you very much. Over.
Thanks, Željko, and so sorry for cutting off there. Just a sense, are there questions in the room? Just could you raise your hand if you have a question? Okay, we have one question over here. Two questions. Okay, I'm going to complete the questions. There's another question online by Angela. Angela, do you mind coming in and also just keeping it brief so that we can sort of do a full round of the table?
Yeah, sure. So thanks so much. I hope you can hear me. I'm in Jakarta and it's like 10:19, so I won't switch on my camera. Sorry. So I'm Angela. I work on Indonesia and also currently working on a CEM for Fiji. I have two quick questions. One is, so I noticed that you released this LTGM TFP code extension, but it's a simple Excel sheet that sort of allows the user to put in a lot of different proposed determinants of TFP, I guess, as education and innovation and lots of sort of variables there. But I was wondering if you can come in a little bit on how one can sort of feed that into the broader sort of baseline LTGM tool, because you can do that and then you sort of see where TFP is going, but it's not super clear how then you can take those numbers and plug it into the model so they can say, oh, okay, if this happens to education, then this is what's going to happen to growth. When Andrew was speaking, I thought that would be, perhaps that was some sort of a solution to sort of the user going into sort of deeper detail of what should you do to increase TFP, and then when TFP increases to that, what would happen to growth? So if you can comment on those linkages, that would be great. the second question is on, there's lots of other tools by MTI that use a Cobb Douglas as well identification that are more backward looking. So you're looking at how has TFP been growing in the past, and how has, you know, labor and human capital been growing in the past. And it would be nice to hear if you've thought about how to link those sort of two stories, so that, you know, you can use these tools for the backward looking of how the economy has been progressing over time, because those are also sort of long-term looking, but from, you know, sort of backward looking, and then use this to sort of forward looking. And if you've thought about how to sort of take the results from those sort of Shapley decomposition type of tools and link it to what the LTGM is able to give you. Let me stop here. Thanks.
Thanks, Angela. I'm going to come to Stuti and then Art, but I'm just going to relay two questions we got from YouTube. One is asking whether the female labor force participation could be parameterized in the model, relating to another comment. And then another question related to, can this model be applied to sectoral growth, for example, agriculture alone, and how would one think about that? Then there is, okay, let's go to Stuti and then Art. Stuti.
Thank you. Great presentation. My question is about, to the extent to which both in the book and in your ongoing work and policy dialogue with governments, how do you make the link between, clearly the questions you're getting are very policy oriented, powerful leaders at the top wanting to do something about growth. How do you link the policy dialogue from this very sort of growth driver accounting exercise to the micro foundations? To what extent are basic public economic insights brought in about the role of government versus markets, and, you know, very simple policies, but the most fundamental of security of property rights, lowering of transaction costs? You know, one of the empirically quantifiable results that have come up in the macro literature on growth is how trust, you know, this very intangible concept of trust matters so empirically significantly for growth. So I'm just wondering, in that policy dialogue, along with your messages about just relying on investment is not sustainable, is there scope to think so with more micro foundations, public economics approach to public policy? Thank you.
Thanks, Stuti. Art?
Thanks, Dion, and thanks, Stephen and Norman. I've watched this take shape over quite a few years, and it's great to see the book out. Three quick questions. The one is, have you thought about doing a sort of retrospective forecasting exercise? So imagine that you guys had designed this model in 1980 and ask how you do over the 20 and 40-year growth horizons. So the projections that come out of the model. So I think that would really help to both strengthen the messages in those dimensions where, where the model does well in sort of projecting the future, and also would sort of point out to the caveats. Second one, building a little bit on the second question, building on the question that came online, not just would you apply this model at the sector level, but have you thought about doing a sort of sectoral version of the model in which you can capture intersectoral factor reallocation and its contribution to growth, which quantitatively is a big deal. And the last question, which is not really unfair, is a little unfair, and maybe it's more a question for Andrew than for you guys, but why isn't this the only tool that we're using in CEMs for long-term growth questions, right? Because there's a lot of proliferation of tools. What are the barriers? What do we need to do to ensure that it's used even more widely?
Thanks, Art. Thanks, everyone. So we have 5 minutes left, so don't feel like you have to answer everything extensively. If you could take sort of 3 minutes, and then we can have 2 minutes with Andrew at the end. Over to you.
All right. Thank you very much. On CERCO, actually, I will just say that I am now in the director of the Global Indicators Group. We do lots of work on the business climate and also on women's economic empowerment, and that will certainly have an effect on female labor force participation and the productivity of the economy. So I would direct you to the work that we do in that regard in the Global Indicators Group. And I think that we can have a close look at what you are doing in your CEM and see how these two forces on female labor force participation and business climate can affect growth prospects for Egypt. And I think the instincts that your colleagues in MTI saying about the limited effects of public investment are right. Angela, we may want to speak bilaterally on how you could use the total factor productivity extension for your Indonesia work. I think it can allow you to do it if you have data for what we call the proxies of these 5 areas that affect productivity. Well, clearly the female labor force can be parameterized, and that's something that we do in the model. On the sectoral growth, actually that we had an extension that we are preparing on sectoral growth that has 3 different sectors in the economy, and we wanted to see, in fact, that there would be productivity gains of going from one sector to another. We have not included it here because it's not ready, but it is in the pipeline of work that we intend to do. The complication with that is that we couldn't do it in Excel, actually, as that was our goal, to always have very simple toolkits. We had to do it in MATLAB. Stuti, finally, on policy dialogue, I think that this is something that we rely a lot on our colleagues and our colleagues in operations to help us understand the main concerns of policymakers, and then how we can transform those concerns into things that we can actually handle in the model. Some of the things that you mentioned are in fact included in our productivity assessment.
Okay, so I'll just add some minor comments. So the second WebEx comment. So on the TFP extension produces a path of TFP which can be fed into the main LTGM. So so they can work together. You just link one spreadsheet to another. The relation to relation to some other tools, so I think they're quite complementary. And tools like the growth accounting tool can be used to estimate historical TFP, which can guide some of our future assumptions. I'm happy to talk more bilaterally about that. For the YouTube comment, female labor force participation is something you have complete flexibility in the tool about how you can calibrate future values of that. To complement Norman's response to Suri's question, so it's true we also, as Norman says, rely a lot on the country economist there, but I think the role of the LTGM is to provide sort of a first step of breaking down a big problem. So the government sort of has this big goal of growth, and then we sort of don't even know where to start to discuss that. And the LTGM helps to break this down into different growth drivers, and then we can have those discussions on the more micro determinants. In terms of Art's question about the retrospective forecasting exercise, so I'm hoping to do one of those just before I retire, as it's a long-term growth model. No, the serious question is, so the Korea chapter actually does this. So the Korea chapter calibrates the model at various points in time and looks at what growth would be if we applied those in the future. And so it has the result is that it is, if you make good assumptions, you get good results. The challenge for Korea's case is that some of the growth drivers change over time. So I think that's all from me. Thank you very much for your comments.
Thanks. We are out of time, but Andrew, I want to give you just a chance to come in if you had a burning two-hander.
Sure, just a real quick thing, because we're talking about the long-term growth model. I just want to emphasize that levels matter. The reason we're interested in growth is because it increases the levels, and that often what we're seeing in terms of sustained growth over the long run is in fact the result of a series of level changes occurring time and time and time after again, either to TFP or to labor inputs or investment rates. And so just a plea that as we're working forward, that we keep in the back of mind, and as we're using the tool, that what we're really after is increasing the level, and we achieve that through growth as opposed to having growth as the objective itself.
Thanks, Andrew. So in closing, let me just thank you, Andrew, again for your comments and reactions, and again for stepping in at the last minute. I want to thank all of you for participating online and in the room. I thought this was an incredibly rich discussion. I want to thank Stephen and Norman for a really good, clear presentation and for engaging on the questions, and also to congratulate you on, I mean, it's not a capstone, I guess it's a milestone in the project of bringing together where things are now, and it's already clear that this is moving forward with additional extensions, and I think we're all excited to see where this goes next. So congratulations on the road here, and looking forward to engaging going forward. So please join me in thanking and congratulating them. And thanks, everyone.